comment, because when you think about it, a lot of power in the Republican Party in the last, 10 years or so has been with the Gen Xers. Just think about it. Think about the rising stars in that party. They've actually allowed somewhat younger people to have power than the Democrats. But today we're going to hear from people who are younger than both groups.
Dan,
Andrea,
there isn't anything about the generations on the chat. If you want to check it, you said you were posting something?
It's there. If you just maybe, can you scroll up?
No, everybody's saying the same thing.
You don't
Actually,
see it?
you need to, Dan, you need to repost it.
I will repost it.
After you post, they don't see prior posts.
All right, hold on.
And you might continue to repost it a couple of times as people sign on.
And we'll do it. There you go. All right, what do you guys say that we start? Welcome to the Jewish Islamic Dialogue Society of Washington OK Boomer event, which is something that we had been talking about doing for a couple of years now. Basically, the raison d'etre for what we're doing tonight is that we have seen the halls of power in this city be held by older generations who don't seem to want to share power with younger generations. We have some number of religious congregations in this city who have senior leaders who are young, but for the most part, the power lies in the hands of people of older generations. And given all the Sturm und Drang that we hear about these days about the problems in this country, we thought it might be nice to actually hear from people who are younger, because maybe that they have something to teach older people. So like usual, after we hear the presentations, we will be opening it up for all of you to either ask questions or make comments. The comments and questions should be short. And we are going to hold the speakers to a max of 9 minutes. I will tell you if you've finished 8 minutes, because we want to hear from as many voices as possible. Let me introduce them one at a time. There are 4 speakers, 2 Jewish speakers, and 2 Muslim speakers. So anyway, welcome to everyone. Let's begin with Nate Allen. Nate is a scholar living in the Washington, D.C. area who specializes in African security issues. His work has been published by a range of peer-reviewed journals as well as policy-oriented outlets. These include the Washington Quarterly, Civil Wars, the Washington Post, and Foreign Affairs. Previously, Nate was a policy advisor with the U.S. Institute of Peace, where he staffed a congressionally mandated bipartisan task force on extremism in fragile states. He is a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He has received fellowships from American University, the Robertson Family Foundation, and the U.S. Institute of Peace. And most importantly, he's a fellow member of Hil Havara. So I don't see you, Nate, but wherever you are, please take it away.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, Dan, and very pleased to be here with you tonight to discuss a topic that is very important to me, but a little bit outside of my kind of academic expertise. So at Hil Havara, I serve as the co-chair of the Tikkun Olam Committee, and which, for those of you who aren't familiar, specializes in both charitable giving and social justice. And I wanted to try to find a way to kind of tie some of that work into my remarks tonight. And in speaking with my wife, Sarah, she remarked that anti-Semitism is one really, really big generational difference between, I think, how boomers relate with their Jewish identity and how millennials relate with their Jewish identity. So she, who is also kind of chair of the anti-racist task force, which is going to be a big topic of my comments tonight, gets the credit for this idea. So, you know, our parents, the boomers, and to an even greater extent, our grandparents have I think, more personal experiences with anti-Semitism than we do in terms of more experiencing it directly as a threat. You know, our grandparents, my grandparents, both fought in World War II. My grandfather liberated Buchenwald. My wife's named for a relative that died in the Holocaust. And I think that for certainly my grandparents and also for my parents, although it varied a lot from place to place within the country and kind of depending upon how religiously observant somebody is, their Jewish identity, in particular anti-Semitism, I think was a really, really important part of how they experienced their Jewish identity or their racial identity as somebody living in the United States. I don't think that is as true with my generation. I always remember being very proud and open about my Jewish heritage, even as I was kind of living and growing up in largely non-Jewish spaces. I actually don't think I've ever been called an anti-Semitic slur. And you know, when it came to how I kind of, what I felt my main identity was identified as a white person, kind of essentially. And it seemed to me, and I think it's pretty evident today, that our country's greatest struggles have been around racial issues and still are around racial issues. And I think, you know, unfortunately, that when we look back on this time in our history in 40 or 50 years, the legacy of the boomer generation is one that is going to be pretty problematic. You know, I know that a lot of boomers and their parents fought on behalf of the civil rights movement, and especially Jewish boomers were relatively important, kind of had played a relatively important supporting role. But, you know, we also kind of, I think, grew up in a time when, while cultural expressions of racial prejudice were very taboo, you know, institutionalized racism nevertheless infused just about every part of our kind of daily life and existence, from like the schools we went to the friends we had, to the public services that were provided to us. And, you know, this, I never remember this ever being talked about when I was growing up. And I think it's become increasingly clear kind of how problematic kind of a whitewashed kind of version of history that white boomers in particular, left and right, bought into. I remember this really striking me when I visited the African American Museum here in Washington, D.C. for the first time. And you know, it's a wonderful museum, but what really struck me was, you know, you have this incredibly detailed retelling of kind of Black history in the United States from, you know, the time they came over, the time of slavery, that is kind of all about how structural racism exists in underprivileged and oppressed people of color. And that history is told kind of very meticulously right up until 1970. And then the museum is all about how, you know, Black people are now part of celebrity culture, how Barack Obama was elected, and all kind of the history since then is totally kind of whitewashed, right? So, you know, I think that, you know, what's been pretty clear is that, you know, and I know this from talking to my parents, older generations, like we live in a society where we directly benefit from things like unequal schooling, like schooling that's based on property taxes, where all these kinds of, like, where, you know, where the drug war and where people of color have a lack of social safety net that has been systematically dismantled over the past 20 or 30 years. And I do think that to some degree, the boomer generation was kind of so focused on winning acceptance as Jews among the kind of broader white culture that they didn't really kind of focus on or adequately address or talk about some of these racial issues. A big fight, even in my dad talked about growing up in Denver, Colorado, kind of being called anti-Semitic slurs, even though he didn't really feel like there was a ton of prejudice. But you know, the fight against anti-Semitism, I think to some degree, for a lot of liberal Jews, sucked the air out of the fight for racial and social justice. And, it all comes down to, I think, so I, and I'm not sure that honestly my generation is gonna do much better over the next 20 or 30 years. But I do think that we're at a moment where we have to do some things that are different. And I do think that kind of as difficult and problematic as I think, 40 or 50 years from now, the boomer legacy might be, there's still an opportunity for change. So here's what I plan on kind of telling kind of my daughter that I didn't really hear as a kid, and conversations I hope that you are also having, many of you, with your millennial children, that she benefits from white privilege, even though she's Jewish, and Jews have historically been discriminated against, that African Americans and other people of color are subject to kind of institutionalized discrimination along virtually every kind of institutional structure, health, criminal justice, education, economic opportunities you could think about. And that, the kind of fight of our generation and probably her generation will be to try to, I think, effectively deal with some of these issues through, schools that aren't funded by property taxes, through reparations, through conversations over, things like inherited wealth, where, I think it's, when over half the country doesn't even have $400 in their savings account, right? Like, I think these are all really, really, really important issues. And that ultimately, that I think the fate of our country and kind of the future of democracy in the United States is tied to ensuring that people of color, immigrants, people from underrepresented groups are afforded the same opportunities that I was afforded, and to a large degree my parents were afforded as white Jews, but have since been denied. So I'll end my remarks there.
Great, thank you. I can report as a boomer that when I was in middle school, I was called Bangladesh at a summer camp, and I was mocked as Super Jew by a gym teacher. So there's just an example. We definitely heard it, and times have changed. Okay, let's go with Selim Kandil. Selim is a third-year student at the University of Virginia, majoring in economics with a minor in psychology. Selim is the oldest of 6 children who come from a family with Turkish parents. Although he was born in Brooklyn, he considers himself Turkish as well. Growing up, his family constructed strict guidelines within the household to ensure that no one forgot their Turkish culture or their Turkish language. And indeed, he remains proud to be a Muslim Turkish American. He is a man of faith who practices strictly Islam on a daily basis. And his plans are to at some point complete a PhD in psychology, specifically child psychology, and to pursue a career that involves both child psychology and education. Take it away.
Thank you for the introduction. Yes. First of all, I would like to thank you all for coming out this evening to this wonderful event. I am Selim Kandil, a third year at the University of Virginia, majoring in economics with a minor in psychology. And outside of my school hours, I volunteer at Core Educational Services as the high school mentoring coordinator. And I have been mentoring high school and middle school students ever since 12th grade. I currently mentor 6th, 11th grade students, and I try to support them with their social and their academic and religious lives as much as possible. Not only am I a member of this generation, the millennial generation, but also I deal with this generation's teens on a weekly basis. As a student, one of my greatest pieces of advice I received from my teachers was to observe and to never be afraid of asking questions. One of the worst pieces of advice I received was that I could do anything that I want. I just have to believe and I just have to want it. Nowadays, I see parents conveying the same idea or philosophy to their children. And as it was stated, my parents did want to teach me the harsh ways of the real world. However, growing up around peers and now educating students who were raised with this ideology, I have come to see the destructive aspects of it. Simon Sinek, one of my most favorite authors, explains how parenting, technology, instant gratification, and the environment are the key characteristics that influence the development of the millennial generation and our current society. Before I get the chance to briefly touch base on these characteristics, I would like to note that I do not believe in the abstract definition of Generation X, Y, or Z. I believe in a universal generation, the golden generation, a generation that leads with a cause, a purpose, a motivation to live for others within the circles of universally accepted moral values. A generation ought to bring a change with patience, with drive, not through disruption, but through education, not through chaos, but rather with order. A generation that is able to take advantage of the mechanisms and tools offered by that current era to lead their cause, no matter what the age may be. The quote-unquote millennial generation we are currently observing within society is a generation who stands by individualism and the idea that they are entitled and that they want to have an impact in this world, which is again an abstract concept, but there is nothing really wrong about it. In fact, if directed with the right coordinations, it can be very useful to establish the golden generation. One of the key reasons why this idea of impact is so abstract is because I would argue that there is no cause behind it. Also, I believe it is because the millennial generation is very impatient. They are brought up to learn that they can obtain anything that they want at any time, especially with the development of technology. These technological devices they own in their hands have enslaved them to a virtual reality where they get used to putting filters over their lives to show themselves off so that they can be accepted and cherished and given attention to. Obviously, this is not how traditional communication works, as boomers would argue. However, these devices pump so much dopamine into the brains of these young adults that it is nearly impossible to snatch away these devices from them and snatch away the addiction from them. In the book called Social Forces, written by Larry R. Peterson and Gregory Donenworth, studies show that with the Industrial Revolution came the privatization of religion and greater autonomy to construct one's own religious meanings. Now with this generation, as the idea of entitlement and individualism grows, they seem to fall astray from religious institutions and religious philosophies. And it seems like it just keeps getting worse by the years. So gathering back all the puzzle pieces, we have a generation that wants to have an impact, but doesn't really have a legitimate cause. I would argue that they do have a cause actually, and that's to collect personal attention and to satisfy their ego and dopamine levels. At the same time, they are falling asunder from society and social congregations and institutions like churches and mosques and synagogues. They also are very impatient, and when they feel that they actually cannot have everything that they want, that they cannot make an impact in such a short time, we start facing a society of young adults suffering from low self-esteem, driving downhill into depression. And as studies show, depression rates and suicidal rates are higher than ever. If we want to establish a golden generation, we have to start off by introducing a cause for their impact. A cause that is not for personal benefits, but for the greater benefits of the society. The older generations should not overlook this intense desire of making an impact that is so prevalent within the Generation Z and the millennial generation. Rather, they should convey moral values and principles to offer them a guide to what cause they may be working for. As a member of this generation, I too want to make an impact, and perhaps that is why I am here talking. But I also have a legitimate cause. I want to make an impact as a minority, as a Muslim, represent my religion in the best manner possible with my success, my communication, my intelligence, my friendliness, and to work for the pleasure of my God. I, as a millennial, do not live or act so others will accept me, but rather I live to accept others, to love others, and to live for others, no matter how different we may be. I believe all millennials should be coordinated in ways where they learn and understand that they have to be patient, that they can't have or do anything that they want, and that they should live for others, and that they should be living for a cause, preferably a divine cause. What I mean by a divine cause is not necessarily closing yourself off to the world and continuously praying in solitude to achieve eternal paradise, but rather observing and internalizing the needs of the world and the society in order to serve them better. This could be done in the workforce, in academia, and in many other sectors that are offered by society. It is easy to say, but difficult to act on and establish, I know. However, I believe that if we start settling these ideologies very early on, kids will not grow apart from society. If we can restrict their technology use at a very early age, kids won't be so eager to receive attention from society. If we can teach them to take responsibilities and burdens at a very young age, they will be more prepared for the real world, and they will actually be able to develop a cause to live for. So to my dear boomer friends, guide and support the millennials with the development of a cause for their ambitious desire to make an impact, so that we do not divide with time, but rather unite as one generation, the golden generation. Thank you very much. That's going to be it today.
I hope we get back to this golden generation. I've never heard that term before. Maybe others have. It's fascinating. Thank you. So our next speaker is Dr. Veronica Slootsky, an outpatient psychiatrist who works in the DC metropolitan area. She has conducted research on dopamine. There's a word we just heard about, dopamine depletion in the brain, as well as postpartum depression. Originally from the former Soviet Union, Veronica has an interest in transcultural psychiatry and has worked with genocide survivors in Cambodia, Latin American domestic violence survivors in Virginia, and has most recently started a collaboration with colleagues in Nepal. She has also volunteered with the DC chapter of Project Rosanna, an interfaith group that helps fund training for Palestinian physicians and medical transport for Palestinian parents. And she is organizing a US, UAE, Israeli joint women's mental health conference to be held in Dubai in March of 2022. And as I see now, she is Hamza's best friend from college. Save the best for last. Go ahead, Veronica.
Thank you so much. So I just want to say that I 100% agree with everything Selim said as a mental health professional. I really do see that with especially like younger patients. It is so, so crucial. And we really need to look at that social media aspect of how that affects folks' mental health. So I'm just going to give a little background about my journey in, dialogue and interfaith, and a little bit about myself. So I moved here from the Soviet Union with my family when I was 5 years old in 1989. And like many immigrants, we basically moved here with nothing. We had essentially like very, very little money, like enough for like 1 month of rent and 2 suitcases per person. And in the Soviet Union, religion in all forms was forbidden. So my parents actually had to take a mandatory course on the proof behind atheism in college, believe it or not. And so we had to rediscover essentially religion here in the United States, things that our great grandparents practiced every day. We had to rediscover and relearn. And I think in that way, maybe the Soviet Jewish experience is a little bit different than some American Jews like Nathaniel, because we were oppressed as a racial minority. So our Jewish identity in many ways is a lot more ethnic than religious, unless you really take the effort and rediscover your religious roots. And part of learning about that involved, when I was in college, going to different groups, different Jewish groups on campus, and learning about different traditions that my ancestors practiced. And at that time, I also met my dear friend Hamza, and we've had a deep, deep friendship spanning decades. And I am so, so grateful for him. And through Hamza, it was actually the first time I was able to learn about Islam. And it developed a lot of respect in me for Islam because my dear friend embodied the values that it teaches. And I actually saw a lot of overlaps between that and Jewish values, Islamic values and Jewish values. And later on, during my medical studies, I actually learned that a lot of medical innovations were preserved and developed thanks to Islamic civilization. Also, I was able to visit several Muslim majority countries in my travels, including Turkey, Jordan, and Qatar. And I think that a love of travel and learning about different cultures really does help with learning and opening up dialogue. And I also was able to interact with Muslims in Israel during my medical away rotation because we also had Muslim patients on the ward. And so I was traveling, eventually moved back to the DC area after spending some time away. And I got involved with a group, a nonprofit here about a year ago called Project Berzana. And this is an organization that raises funds for medical equipment for Palestinians. They recently raised money for ventilators because of COVID-19. And they also connect volunteer Israeli and Palestinian drivers to help get Palestinians the emergent medical care that they need that might occur due to roadblocks. And also helps Palestinian physicians and psychotherapists go for advanced medical training in Israel. And our local chapter also has done some joint volunteer sessions, like at a local DC food bank. And at this time, I do practice medicine in Northern Virginia. And I would estimate that about 10 to 15% of my patients are actually Muslim. And I think it is important to have some familiarity with the religion and the culture of folks to really be an effective doctor. And kind of unrelated, but somewhat related, I recently, during the COVID-19 lockdown, started to learn Arabic because I thought it was important to understand this culture and because it's such a challenging, beautiful, and interesting language. And I wanted a mental challenge because I was so bored with the lockdown. It's extremely difficult and I'm still working on it, but even knowing a little bit of Arabic seems to really help me connect to my Arabic only speaking patients. And I don't know if that's because not a lot of Westerners really learn or just because it's just cool when someone knows a few words in your language, maybe a combination. So now while I was learning Arabic, I suddenly heard that there's this historic agreement between the UAE and Israel. And I thought, well, I want to go. So I convinced one of my mentors in Israel, a mentor who organized a neuropsychiatry conference back in 2015 in Israel, that we should have a conference in the UAE, a joint Israeli, US, UAE Women's Mental Health Conference. And so that's exactly what we're planning for February of 2022. And I hope this new endeavor will allow new relationships to blossom. And as a note, kind of similar to what Nathaniel said, I think it's really important as Jews to stand against oppression and discrimination, whether that be here in the US, given the horrific attacks in mosques and synagogues, or abroad, where innocent Uyghurs are being held in actual concentration camps in China, simply for their identity and their religion. And this issue is very close to my heart. My family, entire family survived the Holocaust and Soviet gulags. And I feel like we really need to do more to call attention and address this and protect religious freedoms because it's so precious and so fragile.
Great. Thank you so much. So we have one more speaker. And then what I'm going to do is just ask if anybody has any quick comments or questions, and then we'll have more focused cross-examination here. I mean, questions. The final speaker is Hamza Khan. who is a democratic strategist and political activist based in this area. He's a frequent guest on national and international news stations, including Voice of America, Al Jazeera, and Fox News. I guess I should say Fox and Friends, a program. Sorry to say I don't watch a lot, but I have seen it. And he provides analysis and commentary on topics ranging from the environment, to immigration, to developing markets. He's also the founder of the Pluralism Project, an organization working to empower everyday Americans hailing from diverse narratives in our political process. He has consulted with members of Congress on outreach strategies to immigrant populations and minority voters. And in 2017, he was presented with the Rising Star Award by Politico magazine and the Living Classrooms Foundation. I know you're not shy, Hamza. Go ahead, do your thing.
So let me start with saying thank you for having me here. And I'm glad. I kind of wish I had gone first now because, man, our last three speakers were amazing. As Veronica noted, we have been dear friends since I was a freshman in college. She has been a mentor and a guide to me over the years and an amazing resource in terms of understanding Judaism and having a look into the millennial environment for young Jews in the DC area, but also across the country, because we work together on a lot of different projects over the years. And so it's really great to be having this conversation and coming full circle with somebody I started my interfaith journey with back like 15, 16 years ago. So that's the exciting part for me. But coming down to it, so hi, I'm Hamza. I have been involved in interfaith work since I was 13 years old, and I just turned 33 a week ago. So for 20 years of my life, I've been involved in the interfaith circuit, particularly here in the DC area, but then also in the Baltimore area where I went to college with Roni at UMBC. And where I can start with when this conversation about millennials, and boomers come up, there's a lot of emotion for it, emotion involved in it for me. And the reason is because when I began as an interfaith activist at 13, the idea of interfaith activism was very unpopular in Muslim American circles. And the reason for that was because at the time we had a baby boomer dominated leadership in the DC region that focused mostly on Muslim nationalistic tendencies that they had imported with them from South Asia and the Arab world. And to give you some background upon this, Turkey was not a part of this movement at all. Turkey, for the most part, was still in the throes of negotiating its internal struggle between the idea of religious modernity and strong Turkish nationalism, which we call Kemalism in the Turkish context. The reason this matters is that the majority of experience non-Muslims in America had with Islam came from basically two or three seminal events in American history. One was the Supreme Court case with Muhammad Ali refusing to serve in the United States military during the Vietnam War, saying that his faith required him to stay neutral and out of a conflict that had nothing to do with him, his person, and as a result, using the conscientious objector status to remain out of the war. Another incident was when Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated by a Palestinian nationalist shortly after winning the California primary, in fact, the same night of winning the California primary, because of Robert F. Kennedy's commitment to Israel's right to exist. And the third event, I think we all are very familiar with, and this one impacted me at 13 years old as a freshman in high school, was September 11th, when Arab terrorists used a deliberately perverted interpretation of the Islamic faith to carry out one of the most devastating terrorist attacks in the history of the world and murder over 3,000 innocent people in the process, setting the United States on a 19-year trajectory of violence in the Middle East and in the greater Middle East, in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, and neighboring countries. And so for me as a young person, my faith had always been a matter of strength and honor in terms of what it meant for me. It helped me get through my every single day of my life. And in addition to that, it also helped me appreciate the greatness of God's majesty and divine mercy. I grew up going to Catholic school as a boy. My parents went to Anglican schools in Pakistan. I went to a Presbyterian, I believe, primary school when I was like a little babe, a toddler. My closest friends in high school were Jewish, Hindu, Christian. There were some Pakistani Muslims in my life who were in high school with me, but they weren't particularly close friends. There were quite a few Iranian Muslims who were in my acquaintance circle, but again, we weren't particularly close. My experience as an American and as a Muslim was around the idea of pluralism and diversity and accepting people for their differences and not engaging in deep political conversations about identity and disassociation with one group or another group. After 9/11, which happened, I think, my second week in high school, if not my first, that all changed overnight. The understanding of what it meant to be a religious Muslim changed greatly in the United States. What it meant to be a part of the American fabric changed. And these three events that I mentioned all became politically charged. With 9/11 obviously being politically charged for me personally, I was there for it, only a few miles outside from the Pentagon. But then RFK's assassination and Muhammad Ali's decision to sit out of the Vietnam War, they also became political events that impacted me, even though I wasn't even alive at the time that they happened. And so the conversation as a young Muslim growing up in this time in the most diverse part of the country, here in the Washington, D.C. region, focused on how do we move forward as a community? And what came from that was a conversation with our elders, who were largely baby boomers and technically Gen Xers, but remember the third world, as we call the developing world, back then we called it the third, now it's the developing world. Their generational mashup was slightly different than our own. So people who were Gen X in the American context oftentimes were really baby boomers in the developing world context. They had a hard time coming out of a world where they were taught to hate Jews, where they were taught to have strong anti-Israeli preferences, where for them, religion was less about the practice of our faith and its observances and its morality and its ethics, and more about strident nationalism and strident identity politics, as championed by people like Muhammad Ali Jinnah, a non-practicing alcohol drinking individual who founded today's modern Islamic Republic of Pakistan, or Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, the Prime Minister of Pakistan, who ushered a huge amount of violence that led to the most number of Muslims being killed in the 20th century at one time, the Bengali genocide, where 3 million Muslims were killed because of the color of their skin by the Pakistani army, because Mr. Bhutto did not want to allow a democratic election to have a dark-skinned man as the Prime Minister of Pakistan. And Gamal Abdel Nasser, who invited tens of thousands of Nazis fleeing from post-war Europe to advise the newly independent Egyptian army and the Egyptian government on how they should run their society, and in the process inculcating Egypt with a strong sense of anti-Semitism that would become the basis of Arab nationalism for decades to come. All of these events had a huge impact on the people who grew up in them, and then were now the leaders of the Muslim community in the DC region and across the country. And so Muslims found themselves on the back foot because we didn't have leaders. Particularly, I want to point this out because Selim's experience as a Turkish American is going to be very different from what I'm saying, particularly in the Arab, Iranian, Persian, Afghan context, the West Asiatic context. We had a hard time as a community accepting the challenges that were in front of us and responding in a way that fellow Americans could understand, because our leadership, being largely baby boomer and growing in a very different part of the world, didn't understand the proper approach to Americans at large and didn't have a foundation in our faith. More often than not, I would say 7 out of 10 of our leaders, if we had to go with, just a number, 70%, had no idea how do we talk to people about what Islam really stands for as a faith, and that we don't support anti-Semitism as a religious policy. It's not a part of our faith, that we don't believe in in carrying out terrorist attacks in order to achieve any religious goal, etc., and so forth. That's a really important part of the conversation for me, because I recognize that we should have a golden generation, like Selim said. I'm 100% for that. But for the past 15 years, because of the deliberate manipulation of the Islamic faith by secular forces in foreign countries. Muslim
1
Americans.
minute, Hamza.
Yep, I'm
1
almost
minute.
done. This is the last point. Muslim Americans have had a very difficult time in having mature leadership in place in order for us to achieve the goals that we do have as Muslims, which is to see a peaceful world in which all of us can live in harmony and pluralism. And some of you might even very well be questioning if that's what Islam's really about. And that's the point. The fact that we've had such poor leadership has led to that. Now, this isn't particularly true in the Turkish American context, I should point out. Turkish Americans are a very interesting group of folks that I will leave Selim to explain, because there are 3 or 4 major spokes within the practicing Muslim community within the Turkish community. So I'll leave it at that, but thank you again for having me. And this is going to be a very fun discussion. Am I good, Dan? Did I go over?
Yeah, you're good. And the only thing I can say about poor leadership is if you were in a group that didn't have poor leadership, you would be unique. All right. So before we have some sort of focused questions, maybe we should just have just a couple of minutes where people are asking questions or making comments. And Rabbi Hannah just sent me a private text with a question, so I'll just throw you under the bus. Do you want to go ahead and okay. I guess the answer is no. Anyway, all right, let me ask it this way. Who would like to ask a question or make a comment about what you just heard? Pick any topic you want, but don't go on for that long. And please put your question or comment in the chat. Or just say you want to be heard. I don't see anything, so I'm just going to go with the focus questions. And before I do, I want to point out that, again, we've been hearing from 2 different generations tonight, both millennials and, okay, they're coming, Millennial and Generation Z. Okay, let's start with Carol Ann Greenberg. Go ahead, Carol Ann, unmute yourself.
Okay, how's that?
We hear you.
Okay, so Liam, I was very, I enjoyed your presentation, and it actually brought me to thinking about my own career, very briefly starting out as a preschool educator, kindergarten teacher in a terrible DC school system, and moving on to solve the nation's problems on childcare for working parents, because I began to see a need to solve that problem. And I think it comes out of some sense of passion about your work. I think that can be part of what relates to what you were just saying, that you have to find that passion. And I like the idea of not, for someone who's not too technical, getting away from that technology and still being able to perform adequately, or more than that, using other people to do the technical work was very helpful. And I just wanted to make one comment about the speaker who said she organized a conference in Dubai that's coming up in February, I believe. I remember a few years back, not that long ago, Jewish tennis players could not even go to Dubai to play. Israeli tennis players could not compete in Dubai. And Serena and Venus Williams, the great tennis players from America, refused to play in that tournament. I'm glad to see that we are now moving more able to participate in these events in the Middle East. That's all I have to share.
Thank you, Carol Ann. I see Herb, do you have a question or a comment?
Actually, a question. Of the 4 speakers, only one mentioned a specific engagement with a faith community, a synagogue in his case. And I'm wondering, really, of all the speakers, a question to all the speakers, what role do synagogues or mosques, depending upon your orientation, play in your lives, if any, and if they play no role, why is that for you?
And before you start, let's keep it biographical, because the first topic area we're going to talk about is congregational life. Nate, you want to start?
Yeah,
The role of that in your life?
Let's go over. Yeah, sure. So I've been a pretty active member of the Jewish community my entire life. My father more active than me, but I was president of my college, Hillel. Went to Jewish summer camp, did Hebrew school, and now we're reasonably active members of our Havarah. I'd say for me, Judaism it's both about community, but I also think one of the things I like about Judaism, but I think also just religious faith in general, is that it forces you to engage on kind of meaningful moral questions in a way that you don't often get just kind of living and existing in a secular society. You have opportunities to come have conversations like this. And there was a time in my career, probably in college, when I was more active in kind of Jewish Muslim dialogue, thinking about kind of going more of a Middle East specialist route. But I ended up through largely kind of happenstance, kind of working more on African affairs, African security issues, which has been kind of my life's work for more or less the past decade or more.
Veronica, you had mentioned that you were not religious when you came to the United States, as congregational life had a greater impact as you've gotten older?
Yes. Actually, we started to engage with the Jewish community, and part of that involved going to synagogue. I went to Hebrew school, things like that. And it's interesting because as I learned about the traditions and the religious aspect of it, I would go home and teach my parents about it. So it was kind of reversed, but it was because, again, we were unfortunately deprived of this due to socialism and the Soviet Union. And then as I got older, like I said, I was involved with the Jewish community in college, Hillel, and then Chabad when I was in medical school. And later down the road, now I'm not a member of any particular synagogue, but I do go to young professionals events. And I think that's pretty typical for a lot of millennials. They would go to the young professionals events and then just pay the fee. But I don't think many of us honestly are actually members of a particular synagogue.
Can I make a plea to everyone who is a millennial, and through you to others who are not here? There is nothing sadder in life than a dying Jewish congregation. And nothing, to me, more frustrating than the idea of all young people collecting together and old people dying together. My mother is too old to be in those generations. She's 99. My father passed away at 90. And when he was in his mid 80s, he kept saying he didn't want to hang out with old people because they act like old people. He always wanted to be young. And there is nothing that older people love more than being around young people. So just like we don't practice segregation, we don't like school segregation and whatnot. And I say this with respect to some of the congregations that are for young people. If only we could mingle. If only we could mingle. Anyway, that's just a plea.
So Dan,
Hamza,
yeah.
You're next, but you can only talk about your relationship to congregational life because that was the question.
Yeah. So I wanted to jump on that real quick. So there are studies that have been done by the Jewish community nationwide that show that millennial Jews do not join congregations, neither do Gen Z Jews. And the largest reason why, it's I think almost 8 out of 10, so almost 80% of millennial Jews do not belong to a congregation. And the reason why is because of the affordability factor of what is the cost of membership in a synagogue. So oftentimes it's several hundred to several thousands of dollars. And millennials and Gen Z simply don't have that kind of money lying around. Like Nathaniel mentioned earlier, most Americans, I think it's 56% of Americans have less than $400 available to them for an emergency in terms of cash or credit. And that's something for folks to think about. If we want faithful communities to be accessible to young people, we've got to realize that, you know, Hashem, God, does not particularly care about how much money you have. He cares about how much time you put into being a part of a community, and communities need to be more accessible, both financially and otherwise. So now that I've gone
Hey,
into
Hamza?
that deal, I'll come to
Hamza,
Yeah,
as a grandpa who used to be on the membership committee of a bougie synagogue, I guarantee you they would let people in for free if that's what they had to do of a certain age. So with all respect to whoever told you that, they suck up their pride, they can join. But I want to hear about your particular religious relationship with the
so
congregation.
I'll tell Hillel what you just said, and I'm sure they'll appreciate your thought.
I'm sure you can send them to me. I'll take the
But
incoming, you know
coming
that.
back to my relationship with congregations. So I've actually been on the board for 2 different Islamic congregations in the DC area. And I've been involved in multiple Islamic congregations across Maryland, Northern Virginia, and Washington, DC. I oftentimes, before the COVID-19 pandemic struck, I had a tradition of going to a different congregation every Friday for Friday prayers. So I have, as a result, a great reach, much more reach than most millennials do. That's very atypical for millennial Muslims. Most millennial Muslims either worship with the people they met in college or through some young professional group, or they worship wherever their job is, because Friday is the Islamic Sabbath. And as a result, we're usually at work. And so we just leave work and go to the closest Friday prayer service. In fact, one of the largest mosques in the DC region, the All Dulles Area Muslim Society, Adams, actually has several remote campuses across Washington, DC for professionals who belong to the Dulles area to attend on Fridays. So just think about that. You know, they'll rent out a space in a church, or they'll get some office room somewhere, and they'll set up a Friday sermon service so that people who live in the DC, in the Dulles region in particular, will have access to that mosque that way. Most mosques don't do that though. So that's an interesting thing to think about. I have attended Friday services since I was in high school. I was president of my Muslim Student Association at Winston Churchill High School. And so I had to put on Friday services. It's a very eclectic group of young Muslims belonging to 3 different sects of Islam, with very different understandings of the religious requirements that were prescribed for us. And we also had a lot of issues with religious nationalism. There were people who felt that we couldn't pray unless we cursed Israel. That was a very awkward thing to explain, that you can't curse an entire country during Friday prayers in a public school.
Hamza?
Yeah.
There's just a question for you. I'm going out of turn because it's related to what you were just saying.
Cal Hopper and the mosque.
First,
Yeah.
yeah.
So
And I would say before you start, you see the comment from Sharon Canner about crying for young people to join the shul without walls costs minimal. But what would you say about the open or unmosqued movement?
okay, so let me
Then we
start-
want to go to Selim. Go ahead.
Let me jump to Sharon's point first. A lot of young professional Jews don't live in Northern Virginia. That's actually the hotspot for Muslim young professionals. Rather, they live in the southern part of Montgomery County, Silver Spring, sometimes in Bethesda, but largely are concentrated within the city of Washington, D.C. itself, in the District of Columbia, and also in that northern part of Alexandria and Falls Church that has metro stations. That's simply the trend because that's where the jobs are. So it would be a good idea for your shul to think about trying to have services in those areas as well. Now, moving past that, and yes, I do know that Nova surpassed surpassed Jews in the latest survey, but those numbers are still kind of iffy. I talked about with a couple of Jewish professionals about that last week, actually, political professionals. But coming back to the Muslim community and dealing with the unmosqued question, the unmosqued movement is a very interesting experience. And this actually goes back to the generational crisis in Muslim leadership in the United States. A number of millennial and Gen Z Muslims and a growing number of Gen X Muslims who are converts to the Islamic faith feel that they are unsafe in the existing congregational spaces that are in place for Muslims in the United States. That is because they're oftentimes run through a cultural lens, largely by Arab American and Pakistani, questionably American individuals who are of baby boomer background and believe very strongly in the Muslim nationalist tradition that is outside of Islam. Rather, it's more about secular identity and using Islam as a source of one's personal secular identity. As a result, they have a very difficult time getting along with people who are there to practice Islam, the faith. Oftentimes, this leads to particularly a problem with women who have come to the Islamic faith or women of millennial and Gen Z background. They want to be in a space where they can worship the one Lord, the God of Abraham, Moses, and Muhammad, peace be upon them all, and of Christ, of course. And the result is that they're unable to have access to these religious spaces because of the strong cultural notions of anti-feminism and misogyny that come from particularly the Arab world. You have to remember South Asia is home to the idea of honor killings. The Arab world is very much still ingrained with a lot of issues that it has with misogyny, and the result is that people don't feel comfortable in the mosque they belong to. Millennial men also feel this way and also have joined this unmosque movement, where people have been producing documentaries and films, and lots of news sources have come out about this, where young Muslims simply don't feel safe in the religious spaces that have been controlled and created by baby boomers who are not interested in Islam, but rather in control of society. So I hope
can I call on Selim? Selim just gave a long answer, I think, to what Andra asked. But Selim, can you sort of summarize what Andra's question was orally, and explain your answer? And I do want to say, with you and Hamza together, we can no longer say 2 Jews, 3 opinions. It's now 2 Muslims, 3 opinions. But go ahead, Selim.
Thank you very much. Well, yeah, so the question was basically from Andra that what makes the golden generation golden? And by the way, Andra, if you are here, you could definitely correct me if I misunderstood. What makes the golden generation golden? And what could we do? What strategies should we engage in to basically move forward? Well, one thing I do want to note is I am the youngest here, and it feels very awkward to be like talking and trying to like give ideas, I guess, around you guys, but great respect to everybody here, all the speakers as well. Well, you know, what I've observed and what I've, thank you, Hamza. What I've observed and what I've seen is that the millennial generation actually, it starts off at a very young age with education. Because one of the first things in school that we learn about is all the segregation that happened in the past, and which is very important, definitely very important. But this subconscious idea starts to develop within our minds, and we have this divide between the boomers and the millennials at a very young age. So we establish this understanding that, you know, everything that happened in the past is wicked, and this wickedness still continues to this day. And we are the ones to change it. Because why? Because we are entitled. We have this sense of wanting to make an impact, and we believe that we're going to be the ones to change it. Well, this is great. Honestly, this is a great thing. It's just, it's not directed in the same way. It's not directed very appropriately because of what this era has to bring, which one of them is technology, as I was stating before. And I believe what makes the golden generation golden is the idea that, you know, we all, as, you know, we should disregard the idea of boomers and like millennials, and we should rather come together under one generation and work with each other's strengths and weaknesses to support one another. You know, the boomers have more wisdom, and for instance, the millennials have the tools of technology. For instance, you could bring these together, but what the problem is, the millennials don't want to take the wisdom of the boomers, and the boomers don't want to take the technology, as an example, of the millennials. So there's this very huge separation between the 2 groups, and I feel like what should happen is boomers should be guiding the millennials and understanding that they want to have this impact on this world. And so but they should be guiding them into taking small steps in making this impact, so that gradually they could become, they could make more impact. And how could this be? Well, I feel like now the education system is encouraging this more often, but I feel like one of the biggest ways to do this is to establish the value of living for others, serving others, being in service, living for others. And how should we do this? Well, not necessarily encourage people to do community service and to volunteer, but kind of maybe force it too. Nowadays colleges or universities really value volunteer work, and they want you to record hours, and they ask, what did you volunteer in? Well, I feel like that's very important, because we should get in, and we should go deeper with this, because slowly what's going to happen is these kids are going to make more impact in the smaller community with the support of the boomers. And as time grows, new changes will start to happen. Just like how Nathaniel was stating, like, for instance, there's less anti-Semitism nowadays, right? And this is a huge movement. This is great. This is great news compared to the past. And stuff like this will continue to happen as, millennials are given the wisdom by the boomers to excel and make more impact. I hope that kind of answered the question.
Thank you. So I want to ask some directed questions. Now, in theory, all four of you could take these on, but you don't all have to, because this way we'll encourage more talking from everybody else. But let's talk about congregational life. What I'd really like to hear about is what ideas you have about how congregational life will be different when your generation has teenagers and young adults. So I'm not talking about when you guys are 42. When you're my age and you guys are in control of congregations, how will you have learned from our generation's mistakes and improved on them? How will you have changed them? Who wants to take that on?
So if no one else is going to take it on, I can jump in. First things first, Dan, you're younger than me, so I don't know what you're talking about, man. I mean, come on, you're like 19. You have the energy of a 17-year-old. That being said, when we talk about congregational life and how, when I'm in charge, recently having been in charge of a mosque, how things would change, I think the first thing we need to have a conversation about is that Selim's on the mark when he talks about this culture of self-aggrandizement and dopamine rushes that really has come to, best describe the millennial generation and the challenges that they have. Unfortunately, many of us were raised in South Asian culture and Middle Eastern culture to seek praise above all other things, to seek financial wealth above all other things by our parents' generation, baby boomers from the developing world. And the challenge that provides for us as Muslim Americans as we try to establish Islamic congregations is, or to better run them, is the fact that, Islam is not about achieving wealth in this world, nor is it particularly about self-aggrandizement. In fact, Islam has a very strong belief that a person who does an act of charity being defined very liberally by the Islamic faith to include social justice, for the sake of public aggrandizement, they will receive their reward in this world, public recognition, but they won't receive any benefit in the next life. And one of the close companions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was warned that the one reason he'll be one of the last people to enter paradise is because he has too much wealth. So we're not a faith that looks particularly towards those things with a very positive outlook. However, because of the way American society functions today, and also because of the fact that baby boomers from particularly immigrant Muslim backgrounds have drilled into us that wealth matters beyond anything else, we are going to have some serious challenges amongst millennial Muslims to lead the community going forward, because we're trying to build a community with a sense of begrudgment to our elders while using the exact model that our elders subconsciously drilled into us. I think to be honest with you, that millennial Muslim leaders are going to have to accept that they are in a transitory position, that they're in a transition position. And their duty is to hand off Muslim institutions in the United States to Generation Z, and to empower Generation Z to be more upright, moral, and ethical than Muslim millennials have been able to be in recent times. One thing that, what's indicative of this issue, by the way, is the obsession, the toxic obsession that many Muslim millennials have with cancel culture, and oftentimes using cancel culture to carry out vindictive strikes against people who haven't done anything wrong. They're just not part of your social clique. That has happened at the national level across the Muslim community over a dozen times in the last 12 to 18 months, where Muslim activists have gone after one figure or another within the Muslim community. There are only 3 million of us in this country, and try to ruin their reputations using social media because they broke up with somebody or because they don't belong to the right social clique. In particular, one example of that is that the Muslim outreach director for the Biden campaign was attacked almost nonstop by Pakistani and Arab American Sunnis because he's Shia. They wanted to get him removed from his job simply because he was Shia, and came up with all kinds of crazy attacks on him to try and get rid of this gentleman because he didn't belong to the right social clique within the Muslim community that had authorization from social media personalities of millennial background to be in a position of power. So again, I think that for Muslim American millennials to get this job done right, we need to understand that, it's not about us, it's about serving God. And as a result, we're too emotionally damaged to do this well. We need to be prepared to give power to the next generation, Generation Z, and to prepare them for that role through them, experientially learning from our mistakes and from our elders' mistakes. And it would also help if more millennials would have the sort of conversations I'm having very honestly, and I think respectfully, with all of the baby boomers who are here today, rather than engaging in shame tactics, cancel culture, and outrageous displays of disharmony in public. We don't have to agree with one another. We just have to be respectful about how we do it. That's a core Islamic tenet, actually, which has been dismissed again and again by millennials, in that, as Selim pointed out, that rush for a dopamine rush when they're taking somebody down on social media. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you. And I really appreciate what you're saying. And as to your last point about having these dialogues, it reminds me of what educators will tell you about, like Women's History Month or African American History Month. It's just a way of marginalizing the topic. So every other month is just, White History Month, White Male History Month. So really the only way to get this done is not just on a session like this one, but to regularly engage with each other. It has to be a regular thing, intergenerational, just like we now, integrate in other ways. I'm just going to say that all night. All right, other folks on the panel. How do you see congregational life changing when the millennial generation or Generation Z is in their 50s and 60s and in charge of things?
I guess I can speak to that a little bit from a place of not much expertise, although I'd love to hear what somebody like Rabbi Hannah would think. I mean, my sense is that, like any generation, is sort of some of Selim's points. People engage in religious communities mainly because they're seeking a sense of community. And I think the ways that kind of millennials go about kind of making community is maybe a little bit different than the boomer generation. I don't think most millennials, at least most millennials that aren't incredibly religiously observant, so mainly reform millennials, maybe some conservative millennials, are not as into some of the more liturgical experiences of Judaism, but they are into, I think, some of the more kind of communal aspects of Judaism and kind of some of the more kind of social aspects. So I would imagine that you would see kind of congregations that are such that they exist, at least in the more kind of liberal leaning Jewish community, much less kind of centered around, a Friday night service, or if the Friday service is going to happen, it's going to be short, still doing things on high holidays, and then having kind of lots of other types of social kinds of opportunities for people to kind of get together, their kids to get together. I think that's going to really contrast though with like the religiously observant community, which I think is also kind of more or less staying the same in terms of raw numbers, which is going to persist, like it has for the past, few generations. And one thing I'll say though, and I'm not sure that I think that the trends are kind of more towards millennial Jews embracing secularism, kind of leaving religious communities, and maybe that trend will continue. I'm not sure what our kids are going to be like. I'll say from like a sample size of one, which is my daughter, who's 2 years old. She loves everything Jewish. She eats it up like in ways that I don't think I ever did. She has a little girl crush on Rabbi Hannah. She looks forward to like spending Shabbat dinner with my parents. I mean, one thing that I always hated, there's a part during Shabbat dinner where you're always kind of supposed to get blessed by your parents. I hated that growing up. I like barely tolerated it. She loves it. She asks like my wife and I to do it like a lot of times when her grandfather and grandmother aren't around. So the next generation could be just entirely different from us in ways that cause them to kind of re-embrace their faith. We don't know. I mean, that's what I'll say.
I appreciate your comments. And I gotta give Liz Goldstein equal time now, right? I will say that one thing that you all did this pandemic that I think is really neat is had focused like a radio show on people in your congregation who are not members of the clergy. So a show about a member that was interviewed by Rabbi Hannah. And I think that hopefully that'll be something that your generation will emphasize more, is the idea that Judaism and Islam is not a spectator sport, but it's about the congregants. It's not about the leaders. So anyway, do the other members of the panel want to answer that one, or should we move on to the next question, which is the most difficult one?
Salim's got a point.
Go ahead, Selim.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I got a quick point to make. I feel like one of the things that are the current millennials, especially within the Muslim community, because of how much I spend time with them, I see is the fact that there's this this dilemma of choosing what culture you belong to, what idea, what philosophy you belong to. Because, like, for instance, growing up, as you guys stated, as it was stated, that I valued myself as a Turkish, even though I was born in Brooklyn, America, Brooklyn, New York. Even though I was born in Brooklyn, I always valued and cherished my Turkish values and my Muslim identity. In fact, just like how we can't eat pork at a very young age, I felt proud about this. I felt very proud. Like, I remember very distinctly, actually, when I was in second grade, the teacher was giving out ice cream, and the ice cream didn't have the letter U. And back then, I was taught that you can't eat anything other than food that has the U or the KD, the kosher sign. And when I saw that when I was in second grade, I was like, oh crap, I can't eat this, And the whole class was eating this ice cream. It looked delicious, and I was just sitting there, and it kind of upset me. I remember vividly that it kind of upset me, but in a way, I felt very proud as well because of how unique and how different I was. And I guess that's what my family kind of taught me, that being different, being unique actually has its power to it. It has something unique to it. And I remember my teacher, in fact, really complimented me and telling me that she was very proud of me, even though she's not Muslim or anything, but yeah. And so I feel like there's this dilemma of choosing what culture you belong to. And especially in the environment I've been, unfortunately, I've seen more of a transition towards American philosophies, towards less traditional values, more reformed values. And I'm not saying that the traditional and conservative values were, perfect. I'm just saying there should be something integrated rather than assimilated. And when assimilation starts to happen more and more, I feel like the impact that's going to be given is going to harm the religious values as well in the future. Like I'm not too sure how it would be in the future, just because I'm still very young, possibly. But I don't know if these changes within the millennials is going to benefit the mosque in the greater aspect. I do know that much of the bad values that come from traditional values, the conservative values, the bad ideas that come from them are going to be eradicated. They're going to be destroyed. I know that for sure. But I feel like there might be too much reformation that could happen in the future. And, I try to be as active as possible, especially like I'm in the Muslim Student Association at University of Virginia. And I'll be the president next year, hopefully. But right now I'm in the religious committee. And I try to help out the people as much as possible in terms of guiding them with their religious values before everything else. So yeah, that's something I wanted to add. Thank you.
So Veronica, you get the next question. It's my favorite question. And I'll set it up this way. I was driving in a car with a reverend who is a friend of mine. And he said that both of his millennial daughters are nuns. And I thought, well, that's interesting, until I thought, wait a minute, he's a Protestant, not a Catholic. He didn't mean nuns, he meant N-O-N-E-S. So I'm pointing that out because they are the fastest growing religious, if you will, group in the United States. It's the fastest growing religious worldview, right? And I want to know, given your experiences in the Soviet Union and the United States, what do you think can be done to stem the tide of apathy or dislike towards religion?
That's a really great question. And actually, I was going to tie it into the last question before we switch questions. And I think it's
do that.
connected.
That's what we do that in this city. We never answer the question. You got to learn the Washington way, right? Never answer the question. I'm teasing you.
So the way that I this is just my perspective, okay? But the way that I have seen things develop, and this goes into how do you see congregations when you are running them? I see kind of three prongs. One, like Nathaniel mentioned, kind of more liberal leaning congregations. Two, traditional Orthodox, maybe modern Orthodox, that have families coming in and whatnot. And then three, something like Chabad, which has an Orthodox rabbi, but the people who actually go to those services and those events themselves are usually not religious. They're just unaffiliated Jews. And I'll be completely honest, when we moved to the United States, it was very difficult for my family to kind of follow what was going on in the Orthodox and also the non-Orthodox. It was just a little bit difficult to follow all of that with the prayers and all of that. And I think the place that we felt the most comfortable, although they have Hasidic rabbis, was Chabad, because they said everybody's welcome here. Everybody. And although they keep their services Orthodox, they have something like some kind of energy in the air where they have so much passion, and you really, even if you have no idea what the heck they're saying, it comes across, and sometimes I just feel like that kind of is missing from other services that I've attended. The second thing I want to mention is that in certain congregations, including my own where I grew up, I went to a conservative congregation. I got a confirmation. So this was when you go beyond your bat mitzvah and do additional studies after age 13 through age 18, I think it is. I think we had a congregation class of about maybe 10 to 15 people, all women. And I have noticed this in my synagogue and a couple other, I would say, liberal leaning synagogues. everyone, like, you know, the school director, the leadership tends to really be female, which is great. You know, I love that women are represented. However, I think it's a problem that the men go missing, especially younger men. And that also is a problem for another reason. Because then if you want to build a Jewish family and find someone to date, they're not affiliated. And so they're not coming to the Jewish professional events and you're not going to find them. So I think I'm not sure how to capture that because I do, especially as a woman, a professional woman, appreciate having, you know, a voice. I don't necessarily agree that women shouldn't sing in front of men. I think it's kind of ridiculous. But on the other hand, how do we keep the men? And how do we engage people with that energy and keep them involved? I don't know.
Can I interject one thing?
Mm-hmm.
There was an amazing program which we co-sponsored last night, and I'll take about 0.0001% credit for it, because it was mostly the brainchild of Ramon Tassat and a zillion other congregations. And it was all about unity. And 90% of the program I adored. The music was amazing. I've heard one of the songs about 5 times today. I played it on YouTube. Great philosophy as well as the music. For the first 10 minutes, my skin was crawling. Why? Because it was kumbaya. And, you know, as a guy who, I can tell you who won the UFC fights last night. I still watch all the football games. I'm a litigator by trade. Kumbaya makes me ill. When they say it's about joy and not oi, I want the oi. I want the rush. I want the analysis. I don't want the peace and love and all that, right? Even though I work for peace. So yeah, these things, there has to be a balance. And there's something about being a sort of, you know, aggressive male that finds all this like lovey-dovey, let's all hug the tree kind of stuff, kind of creepy. And there's a lot of that in tradition, in religion today. So that is part of an answer to your question, whether you want to hear that or not. I'm just saying it, you know, you see that a lot in religion today, in non-Orthodox religion. Does anybody else want to solve the problem with bringing back the nuns, dealing with apathy or dislike?
Dan, I just got to jump in here when you talk about these nuns and it being a problem. You have to recall, folks, that my family is South Asian. I'm Pashtun on my father's side, and Syed, which means my mom's family is from Iraq on my mother's side. And so they all jumble together in South Asia. And South Asia is actually, you know, we've had Islam in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Kashmir, and Nepal, and Afghanistan for over 1,000 years. So we've got a little experience with this. During the last great era in Indian history under Akbar the Great, India had the world's largest middle class. And that is where the language of Urdu actually began to emerge, with all these immigrants coming from across the world to be part of India. Arab immigrants, Uzbek immigrants, Turkish immigrants, you name it, everybody was coming together and all these languages were mixing together. And that's how Urdu, the language of Pakistan today, formed as a result of all this mixing. Why does this matter in the case that we're talking about now? We had a lot of nuns. You know, Akbar the Great was technically a Muslim. He created his own religion that had 15 followers, Din-e-Ilahi, which means the enlightened faith, which was really just Islam with some Hindu syncretism in terms of spirituality, but it was really just still Islam. And since, you know, the whole country took the lead from their emperor, their Mughal emperor, Akbar the Great, people across the country started to have serious conversations about what their religious identity was. It was a period of great pluralism and tolerance. And one of the greatest Islamic poets of that era, Bulleh Shah, wrote a poem that is now famous to all of us who are from South Asia, called Who Am I, Bulleh Shah? That's literally the name of the poem in Punjabi. And the poem, which is now a very popular song in India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, is a bunch of verses where God is addressing the poet Bulleh Shah and saying, am I in the mosque? No, I'm not in the mosque. I'm not in the fire temple. I'm not in the Hindu temple. I'm not in the Ganges River. I'm not in Mecca. I'm not here. I'm not there. I don't belong to Turkish Muslims. I don't belong to Hindus. I don't belong to Sikhs. who am I, Bulleh Shah? And actually, when you say it that way in Punjabi, it's a taunt. God is taunting Bulleh Shah to define who he is. And the point of this, this particular poem is to illustrate during one of the most important eras in human history that people were willing to have conversations about how they don't belong to any box. And yet we consider Mughal India to be one of the finest periods of Islamic rule anywhere in the world. Why does that matter? Because we're going through something similar here in the United States. We haven't had an Akbar the Great, unless you want to consider Obama with him giving the Queen of England like an iPhone as a gift, our version of Akbar the Great. We haven't had one of those, but we do have the world's largest middle class, unless you want to count the Chinese, who you shouldn't, because their numbers are made up. We are a society where we're having religions and conversations about religion and faithful identity and spirituality happen at rapid speed in the same way that Mughal India did. And it's creating a very beautiful environment where people might be putting down none, but only a generation after Akbar, people were again joining different religious communities with a far more open mind. In fact, the only reason that partition happened in 1947 was because of the British. Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians had been living together, and Buddhists had been living together in peace for centuries up until that point, because of this none movement that we went through in South Asia. So my pushback to you is that I don't think we have to worry so much about bringing people back to organized religion. I think organized religion needs to catch up to the fact that the shared values that we have across the board, regardless of our faiths currently, are just so much more important in terms of us forming a better, stronger American identity. So that's my thought on it. I want folks to stay Jewish if they want to be Jewish, but give your grandchildren and kids a little bit of a break here. Maybe being labeled isn't what's needed right now, as much as them practicing in their heart what Hashem, Allah, expects of them.
As I said, that was my favorite question. I will show you the respect of not responding to your answer.
Thank you, Dan.
And because I also want to make sure we save enough time for the next general topic, and Nate, I'm going to start with you, which is the realm of social action and politics, something that I understand your generations care a little bit about. At least that's what I hear. So again, as a boomer, we grew up in a time when the booming voice was that of Walter Cronkite or two or three other individuals who are on TV. And when they spoke, everybody listened, and they thought that they were hearing objective and impartial truth. And nowadays we have a bazillion news outlets. Each one seems to cater to a particular point of view. And we have party leaders that are very polarized and oppositional. And we can't even pass an infrastructure bill, even though presumably everybody wants one. So I gather you guys might want to do things differently. So I want to give you an opportunity to say how you see the way we get our news evolving, and do you see a way that our country can become more unified and our government can be more productive? So I'm giving you a few little ways of departing from that question. So Nate, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's a really tough question, but
I know.
I think one of the biggest ones our generation faces. You know, it's clear we live in a fragmented media environment. I mean, I think to some of Selim's points about how our generation does or does not engage in political activism. You know, as a social scientist from the literature I've read, one of the keys to success in any social movement is coordination and strategic planning and centralized coordination. And you can maybe, and I think one problem we have now, that's part of why the civil rights movement was successful. I study Africa. That's why the movement to kind of overthrow Omar al-Bashir, who was, you know, super entrenched authoritarian regime, was successful. I'm not sure that that we have that kind of coordination for progressive causes right now in the United States on the left. And, you know, it's not, maybe we'll get there as a result of some kind of critical juncture. You know, but right now I think my sense is a lot of the activism is somewhat spontaneous, which offers strengths, but also is a weakness, right? I mean, it's given, I think it's part of what explains some of the spread of authoritarianism we see across the world, and that authoritarian regimes have learned to kind of wait social movements out, kind of crack down on them one by one, make it, crack down on social media, create barriers to coordination. And I'm not sure how centralized or strategic a lot of the coordination kind of always is. So I think, to a large degree, whether or not kind of our generation is going to be successful in confronting these challenges is how we deal with kind of what Selim's saying, a lot of the technological challenges that we face, how we make civil discourse civil again, probably is going to have some degree of regulation, I think, of social media companies and what is said online. Not in the United States, but you increasingly see countries all over the world, even kind of liberal democracies in Europe, increasingly moving towards a model where what is posted online is somewhat regulated and kind of social media companies are held accountable, I think, in an attempt to create some kind of civil public sphere. But of course, do it wrong, and it's really, really dangerous. I think, in Africa, where I study, like 90+% of the regimes are passing very broad information security laws that basically allow them to either take offline or imprison any kind of speech that they see as being against the regime. So I think it's the central challenge of our time. It's technological, but it's also not so different, I think, than a lot of the challenges that were faced in the early 19th century when you had yellow journalism. President Trump did not create the term fake news. Williams Jennings Bryan in the early 20th century coined the term fake news to talk about how he was cheated of being elected the Democratic nominee as president. So to some degree, even though the technology is new, the problems that we're facing are old. I only hope that our generation, and as Selim said, I think this is also not. It says we can be assisted by the boomers. The boomers are still very, very powerful, right? Like, it's up to us over the next really 5 or 10 years to solve these issues. They're enormous, and I think we'll determine certainly the direction of the United States, if not the direction of global politics for probably the course of our working lifetime.
Thanks. And so what I'm going to do is we're going to hear from Selim next. And then before we hear from our other two speakers, I want to open it up again so we get more voices. So, but we're going to stay on this question about the realm of social action and politics. Selim, do you want to comment about that?
Yeah, of course. Well, I feel like in terms of politics, one thing to really note that is these this is actually an idea that's been discussed with politicians and many speakers, and I'm just going to share my thoughts on it. And that is the fact that nowadays news and politics is watched but not listened to, and that is with the invention of the television, obviously. And it's not like it used to be where people would listen from radios. And nowadays, many people are influenced with what they see as well, right? What's portrayed on media, what's shown visually, rather than what's spoken. And I feel like nowadays the millennials have to face this challenge of trying to pick sides based off of not only what their values may be, but also with where power lies to with what they see. And it's definitely a very difficult question, and I wouldn't be really able to elaborate much on politics, especially. I just wanted to add this small thing to it. But yeah, that's probably going to be what I'm going to say for now.
We are going to hear from the other two speakers on this question, but just because this is JIDS, I got to open it up for a little while. So if you have something to say, just say, I have something to say, whether it's a question or a comment in the chat. And I'm looking at the chat now and see if anybody would like to speak, either ask a question or a comment. If I don't see anything, we're just going to go to Veronica next. Okay, why don't we go to Veronica next, and then I will call on whoever wants to speak, who puts their name in the chat. Go ahead, Veronica. What would you like to say about the realm of social action and politics in response to the way I introduced that question?
So I think it is extremely important to my generation to seek justice and to have a positive impact on the world and to have meaning in our work. And I think there have been articles about this, like millennials really want something that's meaningful, where they're contributing and things like that. So on and so forth. And I think that ties into this. And I think that certain people in my generation are involved with local movements, local social justice. Some folks are more involved with international stuff. But regardless of what your area of interest is and whatnot, I do kind of see that common theme where folks are looking on beyond themselves and trying to improve the world. And I would say that that is across the board, you know, somewhat secular to kind of reform to orthodox. I think that's across the board.
Okay, appreciate that. Hamza, I'm not going to direct the question. We're going to leave it at that with the question and take on whichever path you would like.
So am I talking about social justice or not then? Just
Social action and politics, based on the intro that I gave you about Walter Cronkite, about the polarization, about the fact that we can't even pass an infrastructure bill. So there's different ways you can take this.
Got it. So the first thing we have to understand here is that nearly a third of the Democratic caucus in Congress today is over the age of 70 years old. One of our congressmen from Southern Maryland, Steny Hoyer, is going to be 80 by the end of his coming term. And the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, I believe is 76 or 77. Not to mention the fact that we just elected Joe Biden, who is also a septuagenarian. The challenge we have today in the United States when it comes to political divisions isn't that we can't get millennials to agree with each other. For those of you who don't know, my three closest friends in the world are millennial Republican Jews who all went to public high schools alongside me and went to public universities and community college. Yet somehow they ended up as Republicans and I ended up as a Democrat, a progressive one at that. But we hang out all the time. We talk about issues all the time. We still are able to negotiate simple things like who's going to pay the bill at the end of coffee or dinner. So I'm pretty sure that I think that the issue isn't millennials getting along; it's baby boomers getting along with each other. And you know, when you work together in Congress and the Senate for as many years as a lot of these folks have, you simply cannot find a way. I'm saying as somebody who's advised more than one member of Congress, you simply aren't able to get along with the people on the other side simply because you don't like them. You've become cranky. You're tired of their antics. You know what they're going to say, what their talking points are, and you know what their game is all about. And it pisses, excuse my language, it pisses you off, and you just don't want to get stuff done. The biggest challenge that America has today is baby boomers. I'm sorry to say this. I say this with the utmost respect. Is baby boomers accepting that their time is over in political office and that it's time to hand over the reins of power to perhaps younger individuals in the hopes that they can negotiate and compromise enough to pass an infrastructure bill. It makes absolutely no sense for those of you who live in the DC region that if you go 20 miles outside of Washington, D.C., you no longer have access to high-speed internet. We don't have a fiber optic grid that is nationwide. More than 3/4 of rural America does not have access to proper internet. As a result, the sources of news that they depend on, the sources of information that they rely on, the sources of income that they are able to be a part of, they are very different than those Americans who live in the urban corridors. and that's reflected in the people they elect. That's reflected in the claim of values that they say that they seem to have yet don't practice when they vote. There's a lot to be said about the fact that social justice needs to be applied from a religious lens, that all Americans should have equitable access to high-speed internet so they can be on the Zoom call with us. And that should be a religious value. That really should be. And religion has been deliberately used as a tool of nationalism and division in the United States, not just amongst white Christians, but across all religious groups, including Muslims. Particularly, again, baby boomer Muslims have abused our faith in order to divide us away from our Jewish friends and neighbors, and also from our Christian friends and neighbors, and put us in the frame of mind that those communities are somehow our enemies. Again, it's not because those baby boomers are better practicing Islam. It's because they are largely from immigrant backgrounds that taught them secular nationalism as a value of their religious identity. It's like when you're dealing with some extreme Zionists in Israel who have conflated the idea of religious nationalism, of being Jewish, with kicking people off of their land, so to speak, in occupied territories, and saying that using any method that they can do to get that done is religiously sanctioned, even though Judaism has a strong tradition of human rights and ethics going back to Rabbi Hillel and well before that as well. So we know for a fact that we have a contemporary example in the Jewish world. Why wouldn't we have that in the Muslim world and the Christian world? So that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with these really set in their way baby boomers who don't represent the majority of baby boomers. They simply are the ones with access to power who are destroying our country simply because they cannot get enough of the illusion of power. In the Islamic faith, we point out again and again that there is no power in this world. As we like to say in Arabic, no power save that of God alone. That is one of the most founding principles of my faith. There is no power in this world save that of God alone and in the universe. People seem to forget that when they get the idea that they're powerful and they're elected to political office. Islam had a similar story, and I'll end it on this point. Back about 1300 years ago, a man named Yazid the Evil, son of Muawiyah the Bastard, claimed power in the Islamic world and then proceeded to murder the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, on the grounds that Arabs were a superior race, even though the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, stated for the record that all people were equal in the eyes of God. So we've dealt with this issue before too in our faith, with people claiming the religion for superiority purposes. And we're seeing that play out in the US today. But thankfully, it seems enough Americans are of common sense mind. They're standing up for it. I would, again, say we're in for a couple of rough years, but I do think that we'll turn the corner soon. And regardless, Islam has one final point I'll put out here. Islam teaches us that even on the last day of the world, if you have a seed in your hand, you plant it. For the simple fact that we do the right thing and we hope for the best no matter what. That's a religious value of ours. I know I kind of had like a stream of consciousness there, like, you know, I'm in the Talmud, so I apologize to everyone, but hopefully that was useful.
You set me up here. Do you know that 1,000 years exactly after Muhammad died, somebody was born? That somebody's named Spinoza. Spinoza's birthday is Tuesday.
Who's that?
And Spinoza would also say that there is no power save that of God. And he would try to prove that geometrically. So yes, Tuesday we celebrate Spinoza's birthday. All right, so do I see comments in the, anybody want to comment right now? Or ask a question, or I will continue with the next question.
Thank you, Dan. I have to go.
Thank you, Akbar. Anybody else want to make a comment? All right, I have a specific question. So there's a millennial I'm very fond of that you may have heard of, even though we don't agree on everything. Such
And
as,
I think
yes.
Carolyn Greenberg had a question.
Oh, Carol Ann?
Well, I had a comment. One
Sure.
relates to, goes back again to our young speaker about Selim and the work. I just happened to hear a discussion this morning about power in the Congress, and the fact that these elderly statesmen are holding the power in Congress. Connie, I mean, you know, and the fact is that they said the younger people may not be ready to do the work. In fact, they implied that they are not ready to do the work, that it's very hard work to get the votes, to really put things on the floor. And you have to have experience, and you have to have real willingness to do the work. And a lot of it has to do with fundraising. And unless we change the work description, the job description, perhaps that might not be something that these young people are ready to do. I mean, that's the old way of running the Congress and getting the votes out and getting the people elected. And so maybe we have to restructure all that. I'm just throwing it out, but I just happened to hear that this morning, Hamza. So I thought you would find that interesting. And related to what Selim said, you know, you say that a lot of these young people, they want things to happen, but they think they're, you know, it's expected of them. It's expected of them, but are they willing to work hard for it?
You know, the most
Throw it out.
talented elected official I know in the country is a young woman of Iranian American refugee background named Anna Eskamani out in Central Florida. She is a millennial who lost her mother to cancer when she was 9 years old and has a twin sister, put herself through college, ended up with a PhD in psychology and one other very difficult field I can't remember, and then ran for office for the first time in her life at 29 years old and got elected to the Florida House of Representatives. And Florida's largest paper just pointed out that she is a contender for governor.
Wow.
That more than just progressives, even liberals are supporting because of just how great she is as a constituent services person, as a prolific fundraiser, as a policy fount of information. I think the arguments being made against young people that they're not ready, this or that. Maryland, our senator, Ben Cardin, was Speaker of the Maryland House of Delegates when he was 25 years old. Okay, we had the longest serving state Senate president, Mike Miller, in history. He was in the office for 30 years and he's still a state senator right now. And he got elected when he was 22, I think is what it was, or 23. You can't make the argument that young people aren't ready if you don't give them the opportunity to try. And young people fail. So
let me use that as a segue. And yes, Biden was elected in his 20s. Millennial, I'm very fond of, even though we don't agree on everything. But y'all know who this person is AOC. So I want to ask the panelists, if you could say something to AOC, advice, something, what would you say? Veronica, you want to take that one first?
Sure, why not? I would tell her about my family's experiences under socialism and that the road to hell can be paved by good intentions.
If I had known you decades ago, you could have listened to my parents' Russian Red Army album. I'm a red diaper baby. So we should talk about that sometime. Selim, you want to take that? What would you say to AOC?
I would say that I respect her. I guess I'm not too sure of what to say at the moment. I have nothing in mind at the moment.
Well, presumably you wouldn't say what some have said, which is, we want you marginalized. Presumably you would not say that. Hamza, you want to take that next, and we'll get to Nate in a moment.
I'd ask her on a date because she's brilliant and I like brilliant people. But, you know, my advice to her would be that oftentimes those whom we don't expect to have a strong relationship with, because there are just too many public factors that make it impossible for us to mitigate, those are the people you have the strongest friendships with. You know, I go biking regularly with a Gen Xer and a baby boomer, three very different political outlooks, by the way, and religious outlooks. And what I can tell you is, because we're all political, all three of us, is that we've gotten a lot of stuff done in Montgomery County and Maryland because of the fact that we look past our obvious differences and we work together. You got to look beyond the package in front of you. That's the best advice I can give anybody in politics.
Nate, and then Kay, what would you say to AOC?
My advice would be actually very similar to Hamza's. I think that, the power of progressivism lies in its ideas, and, AOC is a very articulate and kind of powerful speaker for those ideas. But to be an effective politician requires strategy, requires thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead of your opponents, and that requires knowing who your friends are, knowing who your enemies are, and being able to kind of work together with people who you might not agree with or respect in order to get things done. And, if she wants to live up to her potential as a progressive politician, I think she needs to work on the ladder, but while retaining her considerable gifts as a orator and kind of caller out of social and economic injustice.
Kay.
Yeah, well, first of all, I completely agree with everything Nathaniel just said about AOC, sort of balancing her very articulate way of speaking and her visionary, her vision with sort of practical strategy. I do, though, the reason I wanted to speak is I did want to respond to Veronica's kind of response to AOC about socialism. And I know you came from the former Soviet Union as a 5-year-old. I studied in Moscow in 1979 as an adult. I also lived in Bulgaria as a high school student in the 1970s, and Bulgaria at the time was basically like the 16th Republic of the Soviet Union. And the kind of perverted socialism that was in the Soviet Union and Bulgaria is nothing like what AOC is talking about. I mean, those are 2 completely different things. So I would not equate them. So that's my 2 cents.
Well, as we come to an end soon, I want to say to all the panelists, you guys did a wonderful job. I was jealous of you guys for your age before. I'm even more jealous now. But I'm a little less so because I saw a t-shirt this weekend from somebody who's, unlike me, he's in his 70s. And his t-shirt said, "I survived the 60s twice." So I hope in 10 years I can get that t-shirt, because that's just fabulous. But so anyway, thank you all. And I want to make a plea to all the panelists and to everybody else who's still here. Let's figure out a way for JIDS to bring the Washington Wizards #1 draft pick and make a program with him on it, because he has a Muslim father and a Jewish mother, and he grew up in Israel. And if JIDS cannot bring this guy, the #1 draft pick for the Washington Wizards, into one of our programs, we are just not very creative. So that is a plea to all of you to figure that out and make that work for this organization. And for all of you who are new, I'm going to put my email address here. Please ask to be included in the distribution list. We have done, I think, 11 programs this year, and we're going to keep going. We've been doing this since the beginning of 2009. And, as long as there's interest, we'll keep doing this. So thank you guys so much for a wonderful and provocative, intellectually provocative evening. And I hope to see you guys soon. Take care.
Thank you so much, Dan. This was fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Everyone.
Have a good evening.
Thanks, Herb, for
Thank you,
hosting.
Dan. This was great, man. Sorry it took me a second to get online.
Oh, that was no problem. It was a minute. It was nothing. Didn't inconvenience us at all.
I expect you to find that guy for Dan,
Yeah.
that Wizards guy.
It's not enough
To
to
find him, you